Close your eyes just for a moment. Take a breath and let it fall softly into your body. In this very instant, you don't need anything outside yourself. Not the pills on your nightstand, not the endless noise of advice from the world, not even the anxious thought that healing must be complicated. What if I told you that within 5 minutes, yes, only 5, you could awaken a force that has always lived inside you? A force that doesn't just cover the symptoms, but speaks directly to your heart, your nerves, your very cells. For centuries, in forgotten corners of the world where the forest breathes louder than the city, monks discovered a ritual. A ritual not of spectacle or drama, but of silence, breath, and presence. They never sold it, they never branded it, they simply lived it. They healed themselves without medicine, without machines, without promises. Just stillness, breath, and awareness. Why 5 minutes? Because 5 minutes is all it takes to change the entire rhythm of your body. Long enough to reset the nervous system, to whisper to every cell, you don't need to fight anymore. You are safe. You can rest. But it is also short enough that your restless mind won't have time to sabotage the process. Short enough that your doubts cannot argue. Short enough that you won't give up before you begin. Healing, in its truest sense, doesn't always come with fanfare. It isn't about a dramatic miracle or a loud proclamation. True healing is subtle. It doesn't shout, it hums. It doesn't demand, it invites. And when it arrives, it doesn't just patch up your pain, it awakens something deeper. Something that modern science can barely measure, but your soul instantly recognizes. Imagine this. Deep in a forest monastery, where the night air is heavy with silence and the only sound is the rhythm of crickets, a young monk sits beneath a tree. He doesn't have medicine, he doesn't have technology, he only has his breath. Slowly, deliberately, he inhales, holds, and exhales, and in that simplicity he feels a shift. His heart eases, his thoughts untangle, his body listens. That moment is not just meditation, it is medicine. Now pause for a second and ask yourself, when was the last time you listened to your body? Not demanded from it, not criticized it, not numbed it, but actually listened. Most of us live as if our bodies are machines, something to push harder, to medicate quickly, to ignore when inconvenient. Yet the truth is, your body is not a machine. It is a temple, and temples do not heal when we hammer at them. They heal when we honor them. This 5-minute ritual is not another item on your to-do list. It is not a technique to master or a secret trick to exploit. It is an ancient invitation to return to yourself, to stop surviving and begin living, to lay down the fight against your own body and finally let it breathe, let it rest, let it remember. And here's what makes it sacred. It requires nothing but you. No tools, no cost, no complexity, only your presence. Only your willingness to stop for 5 minutes and open the door that has always been there. Because the truth is, healing doesn't always arrive from the outside. Often, it emerges from the silence we've forgotten how to enter, from the breath we've neglected, from the awareness we've abandoned in the rush of our days. So as we begin this journey together, let your heart be curious. Allow yourself to imagine that perhaps the most powerful medicine is not found in a bottle, but in a breath. Not in what you add to yourself, but in what you release. For 5 minutes, you will not try to fix anything. You will not demand results. You will simply open. And in that opening, you may discover what countless monks, seekers, and healers discovered long before us. That the path to true healing has always been within you, waiting patiently, like a quiet friend. Take one more slow breath with me now. Inhale gently through the nose, hold it softly, and let it go, long and slow. Feel that. That's where our story begins. If you follow the sound of the wind beyond the villages, beyond the markets, beyond the cities, you will eventually find yourself in the heart of the forest. There, the trees stand taller than time itself, and silence hangs heavy like a sacred curtain. It was here, far from the noise of kingdoms, far from the comforts of ordinary life, that the ritual you are about to learn was born. The forest monks lived lives most of us could barely imagine. No roofs above their heads, only the branches of trees. No walls to protect them, only the wide embrace of nature. They slept on the forest floor, sometimes with snakes coiled nearby, sometimes with the cries of wild animals echoing through the night. They ate what the forest gave, they walked barefoot on the earth, and they prayed with the sound of rain. These monks were not seeking comfort. They were seeking truth. And in that search, they discovered something medicine could never teach them. They realized that the body, the mind, and the spirit are not separate. They are threads of the same fabric. Tug one and the whole cloth trembles. Heal one and the entire being begins to glow. There were no books to guide them, no laboratories to analyze them. The teachings were not written down in ink. They were written in the silence of dawn, in the rhythm of breath, in the way the body responds when it finally lets go of fear. When a disciple was ready, the master did not hand him a lecture. He offered him a breath. He showed him a gesture. He let him sit in stillness until the disciple felt what could never be explained. Imagine standing in that forest where the air is thick with the scent of earth after rain. A monk sits cross-legged, his hands forming a gentle chalice as though receiving an invisible gift. He doesn't speak. He doesn't perform. He simply breathes. And if you were close enough, you might feel it. The air around him shifting, softening, becoming almost luminous. That is the wisdom of the forest monks, healing not as performance but as presence. They believed illness did not begin in the body. It began much earlier, when the breath grew shallow, when tension lingered, when vibration fell out of harmony. By the time the body cried out with symptoms, the real imbalance had already taken root. So the monks didn't just treat the pain. They returned to the moment before the pain arose. They tuned the breath, they softened the mind, they realigned the spirit. In that place, healing happened naturally. And though centuries have passed, the forest still whispers the same lesson, that true medicine is not always something you swallow. Sometimes it is the silence you allow. Sometimes it is the exhale that empties you. Sometimes it is the golden light you let stream through your body, not because someone told you to believe, but because your body remembers how to receive it. This is the legacy carried forward to us. A practice so simple it can fit into 5 minutes, yet so profound it carries the weight of centuries. The monks gave us no theories, no formulas. They gave us a doorway, and today you are being invited to step through it. Think about it. While the world races for cures outside, these monks turned inward. While others searched for new remedies, they returned to the oldest one, the breath itself. And in doing so, they uncovered a truth that still waits for us, even now, in the middle of our modern chaos. So as we journey deeper, let the forest monks guide us. Let their silence speak. Let their wisdom remind you. Healing begins not in struggle, but in surrender. Illness is something we all know too well. It creeps into our lives quietly, sometimes through the body, sometimes through the restless mind, and often through the heavy weight of emotions we carry. In the modern world, we're taught to fight sickness, to see it as an enemy that must be crushed, medicated, and conquered at all costs. But in the Buddhist way of seeing, illness is not merely a breakdown of flesh and bones. It is a teacher. It is a mirror. It is the body's sacred way of whispering truths that the mind has long ignored. The Buddha often reminded us that this body is fragile, that it bends and breaks like a clay pot. But he never spoke of that fragility with despair. Instead, he pointed us toward the deeper lesson, that within every ache, every fever, and every breath of pain lies an opportunity to awaken, to see suffering as not just something to escape, but something to study. Imagine this: a forest monk in northern Thailand wakes with a sharp pain in his chest. There are no hospitals nearby, no modern machines to measure what is wrong. What does he do? He does not panic, he does not curse his fate. He sits, he breathes, he watches the pain as though it were a visitor. In his calm presence, the illness becomes less of a monster and more of a messenger. It reveals where tension has been stored, where anger has been hidden, where the past still clings. From the Buddhist lens, illness is not random. It is deeply connected to the law of cause and effect, the weaving of karma and the patterns of how we live. When we hold grudges, the body tightens. When we live with greed, the heart grows restless. When we drown in fear, the breath becomes shallow. Over time, these invisible chains pull us into visible disease. In this way, healing cannot come from medicine alone. It must also come from insight, from untying the knots in the heart. One of the Buddha's great insights was the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And if we dare to look at illness through that very lens, a new clarity arises. First, the truth of suffering. Illness is part of being alive. None of us are spared. Second, the cause of suffering. Often it is our clinging, our refusal to let go of youth, health, or control. Third, the possibility of freedom. Peace is still possible even in a sick body. And fourth, the path. Mindfulness, compassion, and wise living can transform how we relate to illness, even if they cannot always erase it. This is why, in Buddhist healing rituals, breath awareness takes center stage, because the breath is both medicine and teacher. When a monk leads a ritual for a villager with a chronic illness, he doesn't just chant mantras over the body. He guides the sick person to return to the breath, to soften into the rhythm of life itself. The ritual is not about curing in the Western sense. It is about realigning the body, mind, and spirit with the flow of reality. And here lies the paradox. The more we accept our illness with presence, the more space the body has to actually heal. Science now echoes this truth, showing how stress and resistance weaken the immune system, while calm awareness strengthens it. What the Buddha saw centuries ago, doctors are just beginning to understand, that healing begins not in pills but in perception. Think of your own life for a moment. How often have you ignored the signals your body sends? The fatigue brushed aside with coffee, the anxiety masked with distraction, the sadness buried beneath constant busyness. The Buddhist lens asks us to pause and listen, to see that each discomfort is an invitation, asking, what is unbalanced, what is unresolved, what is still waiting to be understood? This is not about blaming ourselves for illness. It is about reclaiming our power to heal in ways that go beyond prescriptions, because true healing is not just about erasing symptoms, it is about restoring wholeness. And so, as the monks remind their followers when sickness comes, do not rush to exile it. Sit with it. Learn from it. Allow it to humble you, to remind you that life is fleeting, fragile, and profoundly precious. In this way, illness becomes less of a curse and more of a companion on the path of awakening. As the chanting echoes through the temple and the breath moves like a river, one truth begins to settle into the heart. Illness is not the end of life's song. It is a verse within it. A verse that, if we listen closely, can carry us closer to the wisdom we seek. Every healing ritual, no matter how small, carries a rhythm, a sacred unfolding that has been passed down through generations of monks and villagers. It is not random. It is not improvised. It follows a structure, a flow like the rising and falling of the breath itself. And at the heart of the forest tradition, these rituals move through 4 sacred phases, each one a step deeper into the art of restoring balance to body, mind, and spirit. The first phase is preparation. This is where the ritual begins, long before any chant is spoken. The air grows still, candles are lit, and incense curls upward like threads of intention connecting the earthly to the divine. In this moment, those who come for healing are reminded to lay down their burdens, to place aside fear, doubt, and distraction. The monk may invite them to sit quietly, eyes closed, simply breathing. Preparation is about creating space, not just in the room but in the heart. For without an empty vessel, how can healing water be poured? The second phase is invocation. Here the monk begins to chant not as a performance but as a bridge. The words, often ancient Pali verses, vibrate with centuries of practice, carrying the weight of countless prayers before. These chants are not magic spells, they are reminders. They awaken the deeper mind, tuning it to compassion, to faith, to letting go. The community may join in, voices weaving together like a single heartbeat. In this phase, the sick person is no longer alone. They are held by the strength of the Sangha, by the unseen hands of ancestors and teachers who walk silently beside them. Then comes the third phase, union with the breath. This is where the ritual turns inward. The chanting softens and the monk guides the sick one back to the most simple, most sacred medicine of all, the breath. Feel the inhale, he may whisper. Notice the exhale. With each cycle, the body loosens its grip on pain. The mind loosens its grip on fear. Breath becomes a river carrying away heaviness, restoring flow where there was blockage. This phase is the essence of Buddhist healing, not an external cure, but an inner alignment with life's natural rhythm. To breathe with awareness is to remember that even in weakness, life continues to move through you, nourishing and sustaining. And finally, the fourth phase, dedication and release. No ritual is complete until the energy it awakens is offered back to the universe. In this phase, the monk and community dedicate the merit of their practice to all beings, friends, strangers, even enemies. The sick person is reminded that their healing is not theirs alone, it ripples outward. As this offering is made, something shifts. Fear melts into trust. Pain softens into acceptance. The ritual closes not with a final word, but with silence. The kind of silence that carries healing beyond the temple walls into the daily lives of everyone who was present. These four phases, preparation, invocation, union with the breath, and dedication, are more than steps in a ceremony. They are reflections of life itself. We prepare when we pause. We invoke when we open our hearts to something greater. We unite with the breath when we return home to ourselves. And we dedicate when we live not just for ourselves, but for others. Perhaps this is why these rituals have endured for centuries. They remind us that healing is not a single act, but a cycle, a rhythm we can enter at any moment, whether in a temple surrounded by monks or alone in the quiet of our room. As the candles burn low and the villagers bow in gratitude, there is a sense of wholeness that words cannot capture. For in walking through the four sacred phases, they have not just touched healing, they have touched the timeless truth that we are already whole. When the ritual has ended, the candles are extinguished, and the last notes of chanting dissolve into silence. Something lingers. It is not just the fragrance of incense still floating in the air. It is a subtle shift, a deep quietness that settles into the heart of everyone present. And it is here in the aftermath that the effects of the ritual begin to reveal themselves. The first effect is a return to balance. Modern life scatters us, our minds pulled in 1,000 directions, our bodies strained by constant demands, our emotions left raw and unattended. The ritual gathers these scattered pieces and brings them home. Through the breath, through the chanting, through the shared stillness, participants feel themselves aligning again. The body softens, the mind clears, the spirit feels lighter. Balance is restored not by force but by surrender. The second effect is the release of fear. Illness often carries with it a shadow greater than the pain itself. The fear of what might come, the fear of losing control, the fear of death. Within the ritual, this fear begins to melt. The sacred atmosphere, the strength of the community, and the steady guidance of the monk create a container where fear has no place to cling. People walk away with a new kind of courage, a calm acceptance that whatever comes, they will meet it with peace. The third effect is emotional healing. Many who enter the ritual carry not only physical pain, but wounds of the heart, grief, regret, anger long buried. In the presence of chanting and breath, these emotions are given permission to rise, to be seen, to be released. Tears may flow, smiles may emerge. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could, and through it all, the heart feels cleansed like a river after rain. The fourth effect is renewed energy. Participants often describe feeling lighter, clearer, as though a heavy weight has been lifted. It is not simply psychological. The body itself responds, breath deepens, muscles relax, and even the nervous system shifts into a state of healing. Modern science might call it reduced stress or improved immune function, but within the Buddhist tradition, it is understood as prana, life force, flowing freely once again. The fifth effect is perhaps the most profound, a sense of connection. In the ritual, the illusion of separateness dissolves. Villagers who may have once felt alone in their suffering now see themselves as part of something larger, woven into the fabric of the Sangha, embraced by the compassion of those around them. and supported by the timeless wisdom of the Dharma. Even those who are gravely ill leave with a sense that their struggle is not theirs to bear alone. They are held, carried, uplifted by the collective practice. And finally, the ritual awakens a shift in perspective. Healing, in the Buddhist sense, is not about escaping suffering entirely. It is about transforming our relationship with it. When villagers step back into their daily lives, they carry with them a new way of seeing. Illness is no longer just an enemy to fight, it becomes a teacher. Pain is no longer only a burden, it becomes a doorway to understanding impermanence, to cultivating compassion, to living more fully in the present moment. The benefits are not confined to those who are sick. Even the healthy, those who join simply to support or to learn, walk away changed. They carry the calmness of the chants, the softness of their own breath, the memory of being in a space where time seemed to slow and everything felt connected. These effects ripple outward. A mother leaves the ritual and holds her child with more tenderness. A farmer returns to his fields with a clearer mind. A student studies with more focus, less burdened by anxiety. Healing does not end with the one who receives. It spreads like sunlight across an open field. And so the ritual's true gift is not just the easing of pain, but the awakening of wisdom. For when we touch balance, when we let go of fear, when we feel connected and alive, we begin to see what the Buddha saw long ago. That life, even in its suffering, is still deeply beautiful. When a ritual is performed once, it is like a spark in the dark, beautiful but fleeting. It warms us, it inspires us, but unless we nurture it, the flame fades. The monks knew this truth well, which is why they never taught ritual as something to experience only occasionally. Instead, they encouraged disciples to bring the essence of the ritual into daily life, to make every morning, every breath, every simple action a sacred practice. The transformation does not come from grand ceremonies, nor from rare mystical moments. It comes from the gentle discipline of daily practice. Imagine beginning your day not with noise, not with rushing, but with 5 quiet minutes of breath. You sit, your spine tall yet relaxed, hands resting softly on your stomach. You inhale slowly, hold gently, and release with ease. This small act alone begins to reset your nervous system. It tells your body, I am safe. It tells your heart, I am home. But the monks remind us, practice is not only about breathing, it is about living. The way you pour water into a cup, the way you sweep the floor, the way you walk from one room to another, all of these can be rituals when performed with awareness. Every gesture becomes a reminder that life itself is sacred. Transformation begins when the ritual is no longer something you do, it becomes who you are. The one who practices daily learns to respond differently to life. Anger still arises, but it burns less fiercely. Fear still knocks, but it lingers less long. Illness may still come, but it no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like part of the great unfolding of existence. Let me tell you a story from the Thai forest tradition. There was once a young novice monk who struggled with constant worry. Every day his thoughts raced, about his family, about the future, about whether he was worthy of the robes he wore. His teacher, an elder monk with decades of practice, gave him a simple instruction. Each morning, place your right hand over your heart and whisper, I am alive, I am light, do this without fail. The novice thought it was too simple. Surely a great teacher would give him a profound teaching, a hidden mantra, a long meditation technique. But out of respect, he followed the advice. Day after day, he placed his hand on his chest, breathed deeply, and repeated the words. At first, nothing changed, but over time, something shifted. The worry was still there, but it no longer ruled him. His heart felt steadier, his mind grew quieter. And one day, while sweeping the monastery grounds, he realized that he no longer felt like a child pretending to be a monk. He felt like a monk, truly and completely. This is the transformation daily practice brings. Not sudden, not dramatic, but deep, steady, irreversible. Like water wearing away stone, gentle persistence reshapes the very foundation of your being. And the beauty is that it requires so little. 5 minutes in the morning, a mindful breath before meals, a silent prayer before sleep, a moment of gratitude when waking. These are not burdens, they are gifts, and they accumulate drop by drop until they become an ocean. When villagers practiced daily, the monks noticed something remarkable. Illness still came, as it always does in the human realm, but those who practiced healed faster. Their pain was lighter, their spirits brighter. They faced difficulties with resilience. It was not that they escaped suffering, it was that they had learned to walk with it, to bow to it, to befriend it. This is the secret the monks whispered to their disciples. Healing is not what happens to you once in a ritual. Healing is what you become when your life itself is a ritual. So when you close your eyes tonight, remember, you need no temple, no monastery, no sacred forest to practice. Your own home is enough. Your own body is enough. Your own breath is enough. Each day, return to this practice, and slowly, you will discover that the greatest medicine has been within you all along. And as the days turn into weeks and the weeks into years, you will look back and realize that you are no longer the same. The ritual did not just heal your body, it transformed your life. As our journey together comes to a close, let us pause in silence for a moment. Feel your breath rising and falling. Feel the gentle rhythm of your heartbeat, steady and unbroken. Feel the quiet intelligence within your body, guiding each cell, each organ, each unseen process that keeps you alive. This is not just flesh and bone. This is not just a tool for survival. This is a sacred temple, and like any temple, it deserves reverence, respect, and care. The monks of the forest taught us that the true miracle of healing is not found in exotic medicines or in distant places. It is found in our willingness to return to ourselves, to sit in silence, to listen deeply. For within the body lies a wisdom older than memory, a strength deeper than thought, a light brighter than fear. When you treat your body as a temple, you begin to move differently in the world. You no longer see yourself as broken or lacking. You no longer fight endlessly against your own nature. Instead, you honor this body as the vessel through which life flows, the ground on which your awakening takes place. Imagine walking into an ancient temple carved into stone, where every corner holds centuries of devotion, where silence itself feels alive. That is what your body is, a living sanctuary, a place where healing and awakening meet. The daily practice of ritual is simply how we keep this temple clean, how we keep the altar lit, how we bow to the sacredness that has always been within. Let me share one final story. In a quiet monastery in Laos, a dying monk once whispered to his disciple, "Do not mourn me when I am gone. My body is like a temple built of sand. The waves will come and wash it away. But the prayers offered inside, the awareness cultivated, the love shared, these will remain. They are not bound to stone or bone. They live on in the wind, in the trees, in you. And so it is with us. This body will one day fade, but how we treat it, how we honor it, how we practice with it, that is what determines whether our life becomes a ritual, whether our days become offerings, whether our presence becomes a gift to others. Your body is a temple. Each breath you take is an offering. Each act of awareness is incense rising. Each moment of gratitude is a candle lit in the dark. So as you leave this teaching, carry with you not just the memory of a 5-minute ritual, but the living understanding that healing is not outside of you. Healing is who you are when you return to your breath, your body, your awareness. Let this practice guide you. Let it soften your days. Let it remind you that you are not broken, you are whole. You are not alone, you are connected. You are not merely surviving, you are alive, radiant, sacred. Bow to the temple that is your body. Bow to the spirit that animates it. Bow to the life that flows through it. And in this bowing, you will find both healing and awakening. The ritual is simple, the practice is gentle, the truth is eternal. Your body is a temple, honor it, and let every breath be a prayer. If this teaching has touched something deep within you, if these words have reminded you of the temple you carry inside your own body, I invite you to continue walking this path with us. Here on Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we share practices, stories, and timeless teachings to guide you back to your center, to help you live with greater peace, clarity, and compassion. So, if your heart resonated with today's journey, I gently encourage you to subscribe, to join our growing community of seekers walking this path together. And if there is someone in your life who could benefit from this gentle reminder that healing is already within them, please share this video as a gift. Every week, we offer new insights, new rituals, and new ways to remember who you truly are. Until we meet again, may you breathe with ease, may you live with kindness, and may you honor your body as the sacred temple it has always been.